So, thank you, Mrs. Danda. Thank you. Muito obrigado pela apresentação. Ouviremos agora com o tema Tomada de Decisão Apoiada como Ferramenta para a Autonomia e Independência das Pessoas com Deficiência, o senhor Michael Bach, por favor.
Thank you very much. This works? Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you to APAE and to the State Secretary for Persons with Disabilities in Sao Paulo and the government of the state of Sao Paulo for the honor to be invited here and to bring my experience and experience of organizations that I've worked with to share with you as you take these next steps on your struggle. And I think Professor Amanda's framing of this as a struggle that is going to encounter resistance is very important to recognize, because in my country, Canada, and certainly in other countries where I've been able to work with others on this journey, it seems the closer people get to fundamental change, the tougher the resistance starts to show up. This doesn't mean that there are good guys and bad guys. It means that there are fundamentally different ways of thinking about what it means to be a human being and what it means and who gets to have power in their lives and in the world. And a lot of interests get associated with certain assumptions about who gets to have power. We'll know this, you'll remember, and we're still in them in many ways. At one point it was men and propertied men of a certain class who were citizens. The rest didn't count. And then, well, okay, we'll let those less propertied men in, but certainly not, you're not talking about women, are you? And women then get constructed in a certain way that makes them clearly not able to take up the mantle of full citizenship. That got whittled away, not because people sat down at a nice meeting and made the change. They had to struggle. As people struggled in the civil rights movements, as people have struggled in Brazil and in countries around the world for liberation of people who have been excluded and denied. So that is what this is about. That's the work this is about. And Amita's call on us to be clear about what the stakes are and to get really smart about how we advance our arguments and come up with strategies to bring about change, I think is the right call for us all, and it's the moment that we're in. So what I would like to do today is to share with you some of my experience and I guess some ideas, some thoughts about how we respond to the resistance, the claim that, well, you're not talking about extending legal capacity to this group with profound intellectual disabilities or cognitive disabilities or psychosocial disabilities. Surely that's not what you're talking about. Or, well, maybe you're talking about extending it to this small group who will say will pass, so we'll open the room a little wider to let a few more in, but not everyone. No, that's not what this struggle is about. It's about, and I appreciate Professor Danda here today and also in previous conversations and presentations talking about this as universal capacity. The issue here is about universal access to the right to legal capacity. So what I'd like to do in my comments today, and I am going to focus on the issue of supports, but not I guess the underlying questions about what it means to support someone to exercise their legal capacity. And I'm going to focus on really three kind of pieces in my presentation. To talk about what it means to rewrite the rules, because the UN Convention rewrote the rules for the recognition of legal capacity. Well, what does that mean? What are the core rules? And Professor Dandas has laid those out, and I want to revisit those a little bit more. What do those new rules require? What do the rules require? The UN Convention, Article 12, and the principles underlying the convention. And then I want to reflect on some questions that I think we have to get better at answering, because I don't think we're answering them well enough or clearly enough to inform effective resistance, or no, effective struggle to the resistance to the change, which is a resistance to the resistance, as you said. So in the simplest terms, this is about moving from restrictive and discriminatory rules for legal capacity to rules for universal access. And I frame this slide very much as the struggle that Professor Danda spoken to. Are we going to go back in that one direction? Are we going to keep those discriminatory rules in place, or are we going to rewrite the rules? The convention says we have to rewrite the rules, and it has effectively rewritten the rules. What those are going to mean in practice is what our challenge is. We have to be able to answer what those rules mean in practice. And I think the new rules for legal capacity address three questions. The first question is, so on what grounds, what's the ground for recognizing a person's legal capacity or legal power over their lives? The second question is, what legal obligations does that impose on the state and on others? And the third question is, how are these rights to legal capacity going to be protected and safeguarded? So at a very high level, the convention and the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and advocacy organizations of people with disabilities and emergent law reform we're seeing has answered these questions in general in these ways. So the grounds for the right to decide, or the grounds for legal capacity in the old model, are that one's mental capacity, one's cognitive abilities, one's communication abilities, that's what gave you legal capacity. Your mental capacity was the ground. The legal obligation was that the state had to manage the boundary between those who were capable and those who were incapable. And remember, this boundary between the capable and the incapable, it goes back to Roman law, right, on which civil law rests. This distinction, certainly in common law countries, in English common law countries, and in those countries that were then were ruled under the colonial empire, imported those laws. That goes back to a law in like the 14th century, the 1300s, which says basically that, you know, and it used other terms, but that there were the incapable, and the king had the power to take the property and assets of the incapable and manage them for that person. And so this idea that there's people who are incapable and people who are capable goes back a very long way. It's rooted in law in both civil code countries and in the common law. So we've got a few thousands, many centuries of thinking about what this means in law. And I think it's also important, you know, it was law that created these distinctions. And then science, public policy, communities organized to help manage that boundary. If you think about psychometric tests, which are used to define, you know, whether someone has requisite or the needed mental capacity or not, it's science serving that boundary. All these classifications about mental capacity come into being after the law has already established this boundary. So part of our job is to change the law. As Professor Danda says, that's not enough, but we do need to change this distinction. The third piece in safeguarding rights is that we will protect the rights of those who are capable to exercise their legal capacity, and will safeguard or protect those who are incapable. Well, the new rules start in quite a different place. The new rules say that the ground for the right to decide is not mental capacity. It doesn't show up anywhere. The ground is one's will and preference. So the new law in Brazil has got it right. It makes expression of will and preference the ground for recognizing legal capacity. Now, it does exclude, as I understand it, those who are not able to express their will and preference. So while there's a possibility here, the critical issue will be, what does it mean to not be able to express your will and preferences? And will this come to be equated with mental capacity, incapacity? Well, it may come to mean the same thing. It means that we have to really define what it means to express will and preferences in a way that's fully inclusive. And I want to focus much of my presentation on that. The legal obligation that arises is one of accommodation and support. To express will and preferences and to turn those will and preferences into decisions that give people power over their lives. That's the obligation. Because the boundary between the capable and incapable is gone. I want to suggest that you can't find someone who hasn't expressed their will and preferences in some way. And people can say, yeah, what about people in a coma? Well, people in a coma have had a history. People in a coma are members of families who have understandings about who that person is, what things matter to them. I want to suggest that there are not people who haven't in some way expressed their will and preference, which means that it is the basis for universal access. And the job of safeguarding is to ensure those accommodations and supports are in place, and to hold authorities and others responsible for making sure of that. And then also, and I'll talk about the shift from best interest to best interpretation of a person's will and preference. There may be times when we don't fully, there's uncertainty, we don't understand. The principle, and the UN committee has recognized this principle, in those cases, you can still arrive at the best interpretation in the circumstances. And that can be the basis for a person's legal capacity. So we've got a new paradigm, we've got new rules, but there are a number of questions that get raised. Well, what do we mean by will and preferences? I mean, Article 12.4 says that all legal measures regulating legal capacity must respect the rights, will, and preferences of the person. What does that mean? The new law in Brazil says, well, people can have legal capacity except if they can't express their will and preferences. We better have a clear understanding of what that means. And there's going to be struggle over this one, I would suggest. So we need an account of what it means to express will and preferences that is up to that struggle. What does it mean to support and accommodate a person's expression of their will? What's the difference between supports for decision-making and supported or assisted decision-making? I think there is a difference, and I want to talk about, for a few minutes about what that is. How do supporters translate expressions of will and preferences into legal decisions when there's uncertainty? When a person expresses their will and preferences, but it doesn't actually translate into a specific decision. Or a person now is expressing a preference that seems completely new and would have big implications in their lives if we followed it, and it seems to be in conflict with all previous expressions. How do we deal with that uncertainty? How is best interpretation of will and preferences different from the best interest tests, and what safeguards are needed? So I'm going to, in the rest of my comments, suggest an approach to answering these questions. But I want to be clear at the beginning from where I sort of, my experience. I began working in the area of disability as a volunteer when I was a teenager, there with people with intellectual disabilities. And that has grown into my, lifetime of involvement as an adult with people with intellectual disabilities and their families in Canada, and have been inspired by, motivated, had this incredible opportunity over these years to work with just remarkable people in the movement for inclusion through the sister organization of APAE in Canada, Association for Community Living. And also over the course of that work, I've had the opportunity to work with people in the seniors, older persons movement, in the movement to advance the rights of consumer survivors of psychiatry, people with psychosocial disabilities. But my formative experience is of people with intellectual disabilities and their families. So these questions come from that movement. I'm not trying to speak for everyone. I hope that the answer, or my approach here, might be one that other communities can take up. But that's where I'm rooted. And in particular in people with really profound intellectual disabilities, who would be seen probably, still are seen in most parts of Canada and around the world as not able to have valid expressions of will and preference that could ground their legal capacity. So my motivation is to try and make sure we answer these questions in a way that includes that group. And I think for me that's got to be one of the tests. It's a test of the proposals that we come up with. And in my own experience, to Amita's, Professor Danda's point, we're seeing huge resistance when it comes to including this group. So I've been inspired by people with intellectual disabilities and their families to ask and work on these questions with them. I've been inspired by many people in the disability rights movement and people writing and working in disability theory. In answering these questions, I want to point to a broader group of people whose ideas I think can inform how we address these questions. Because this question number one, for instance, what does will and preference mean, is a big question. It's a huge question in philosophy and has been for a few thousand years. And we can benefit, I think, from some of that thinking. So I put some pictures up here of a few people that inform my thinking on this and that I think we can productively draw upon. The first picture on the top left is Edmund Husserl, philosopher from the 19th century. And one of the things that is important about his work is that he was a theorist of consciousness. What does it mean to have a mind? And his kind of answer that is really helpful for us, I think, is that he said effectively that what consciousness is, what mind is, it's about intentionality. We all intend towards something that matters to us. There's some things in our world that we care about and we go out to them. And our consciousness is about going out to those things beyond us that matter to us. Intentionality is what defines us as human beings in the world. Other species have intentionality, but we're not other species, so we don't know about their intentionality. So we can talk about what it means to be a human being is to intend into the world, to go out to things and people that matter to us. And being able to be in the lives of people with profound intellectual disabilities, that's so clear. You see someone who wants to be around someone that they like, and you see them move away from someone that they don't like or feel uncomfortable with. They're intentional beings. They're intending about to things that matter to them. Yeah, okay, thanks. In the middle is another philosopher, Irish philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, who wrote in the 20th century and wrote a brilliant little book called Intentionality. Well, what does that mean? And her point was that, people's behavior can be intentional under some descriptions, but appear as not intentional under other descriptions. So when we look across the room at someone, and here again I think about people with intellectual disabilities, if you don't know that person, the description that we would provide of that person is, they have maladaptive behaviors or self-harming behaviors, or they've got challenging behaviors. Elizabeth Anscombe's point is that that's behavior under one description. If you knew the person well, you could re-describe that behavior, and certainly people who know and who are in that person's lives would re-describe that behavior as very intentional. They don't want to be here. They don't want you in the room describing them. Intentionality is behavior under some description. People with disabilities have been weighted down by the descriptions of others about their actions, about their behaviors, which make them non-human. But that's just their behavior under some description. What people haven't had the power to do, and what's been completely disrespected, are accounts, descriptions of their behavior that turn them into intentional beings. In between, well, actually on the bottom, Hannah Arendt wrote this brilliant book in the middle of the 20th century called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And her point was that certain groups, certain people, are made foreign by their differences. And we strip them of rights and powers on that basis. And once people become foreign in the eyes of those who have power, they are treated, and she was writing about the Holocaust, with indescribable violence and exclusion. So Hannah Arendt's point is, be very careful about how you write, how you turn some people into foreigners, and question always laws that produce the foreigner. And that's another way in which people with disabilities have lived. They've been turned into foreigners in their own communities, in their schools, in their workplaces, in their societies. And she says that's the origins of totalitarianism. In between Professor Husserl and Elizabeth Anscombe is Amartya Sen, a philosopher and economist from India. And he writes about what it means to be equal. What it means to be equal is that you have the capabilities to accomplish certain things in your lives. And what Professor Sen says about capability is that it's not something that you have inside you. You only have your capability because of the goods and services and supports that you get from others. He uses the example, actually, of a set of stairs. At the bottom of the stairs is someone who uses a wheelchair. Now, the person who walks up those stairs is capable of getting to the top of the stairs. The person who uses the chair is not capable of getting to the top of the stairs. Well, what we've said, you know, is, well, yeah, that person's incapable. That's probably why they shouldn't even be in the community. Professor Sen says, yeah, but step back and look at the picture here. The only mode of getting up to that elevation is the stairs. This person can't use the stairs. He uses a wheelchair. There have to be other ways. There have to be other ways of making him, that wheelchair user, capable. It's not about his or her particular abilities. It's what's in their environment, in a person's environment, that makes them capable. The last picture on the right, Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator and philosopher. My father gave me the book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, when I think I was 19. And it just had a transformative effect on my life and has influenced so much how I have been involved and the work that I support and I'm involved in. And one of, Paulo Freire's main points is that for change to come around, for struggle to be effective, people who have been silenced need to find a voice. It's the silencing of people. And the ways in which people with intellectual and other disabilities have been silenced and not had their expressions of their own expressions count as valid expressions of intentionality in the world is a huge part of the problem. So how we end the silence is a big part of what we do. There are many others, but I wanted to put some faces to some of these ideas, because this isn't going to happen inevitably. Back to Professor Danda's point. People have to change their ways of thinking. And we've got lots that we can draw upon as we do this. So I'm going to provide here one approach to defining will and preferences, building on some of the things that I've said. So the starting point is that we are all intentional beings. Our basic intention, we're intentional by nature. It's in our cells. And some of the neuroscience, the new neuroscience is pointing to this, that talks about nano-intentionality. We are, like in our very cells, we're intentional beings. Cells have intentions about them. And that we have many intentional states. We're directed to things we like or want and away from things that we don't want. So I think it's important to talk about intentional states, not mental states. Edmund Husserl challenged fundamentally the whole set of constructions in psychology and said, step way back. Let's just look at what people do. And as Elizabeth Anscombe said, let's describe it as intentional. And And that our intentions and behavior become, or that our behavior comes intentional under some description, as I've said, whether by ourselves or others, but our intentions can conflict. Because as human beings, we have conflicting desires and intentions. But as we experience that conflict, we evolve preferences that help us make judgments and decisions in our lives. Certain things matter to us more than others. I remember when my 4-year-old son, Eli, came and said, "Daddy, please stop smoking." Now, and this is not to be morally righteous about smoking, but in my life, that's the thing that just did it for me. For my son to come to me and say he didn't want to see me do that, first, it's my care, my love for my son, it upset him, it made, whatever it did, I decided that was more important for me in that situation. So as much as I like smoking, this desire to be there for my son in a way that made him feel safe overpowered that. And I did still sneak a few cigarettes when he wasn't looking, but you know, we're all human, right? So, but we still have to decide. And so our free will, if you will, is the choices guided by those preferences that help us deal with conflicts in any particular situation. We also explore, we develop our will by experience, by having opportunities. This is one of the biggest challenges for people with more profound intellectual disabilities or psychosocial disabilities who have been so excluded, not being given the opportunity to develop preferences so that they can actually make choices. One of the big issues in deinstitutionalization, people say, oh, well, they don't want to leave the institution. They're happy where they are. Have they been given the opportunity to live outside and be involved and included in their communities? We all need capabilities to put our will and preferences into effect and into action, and this takes supports and resources from others. I know I probably only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to move through this. So the second question is, so just to summarize that first question, what are will and preferences? We have to start from the assumption that we're intentional beings. We're all intentional beings, and under some description, at least. And that our preferences evolve as we go through the world. And we evolve our preferences. And those preferences help guide our action, our decisions at any one point. And our will is that decision that we make to choose one set of preferences over others. So how do we accommodate this? I put up on the slide a number of ways of accommodating and supporting people. People need opportunity, they need time, they may need advocacy support, they may need plain language and communication support. I want to focus on 3 areas of support to support people with more profound intellectual disabilities, which I refer to as interpretive support, planning support, and executive support. And I want to talk about this in the context of distinguishing between supports for decision-making, that whole list that I just pointed out, those are the kinds of supports for decision-making, and what supported decision-making is. What's the difference? So I think there are different ways of making decisions with support. One way, there each of us is deciding what preferences we're going to pursue in any particular situation. And there's the state and the UN that has recognized my right on the basis of my will and preferences to have power over my own life. And I'm going to need to make decisions in my life about health care, about what I'm going to do with my money, and property, and decisions about where I'm going to live and work, and let's call that the community. And so the question is, how am I going to make my way into the community with support and accommodation? Well, one way is that I could do it on my own, independently with supports. The plain language advocacy support could be informal support. And I'm thinking here about many self-advocates who are here today and that I've had the chance to meet elsewhere, who want to make decisions on their own, but they want to have some assistance. They don't want to have a whole group of people around them. They want to make decisions by themselves, go to the doctor by themselves or with a friend, but they're still very much in control on their own. A second way I think that it's helpful to talk about this is where is supported decision making. But supported decision making has a very particular meaning, at least in my experience in the work that we've done. And that's where the support that I need is the support of a person or a network around me who's legally appointed, legally recognized to be my interpreter, to help me make plans and to execute those contracts. In my experience, a person with a profound intellectual disability who may not be able to communicate or express their will in ways that a judge may understand or a doctor may understand, but they're still expressing their will. They're still intentional beings, but they need people around them who can describe their expressions as intentional, right? Going back to my earlier point. What they're missing is having someone who can describe to the judge that actually Michael's behavior, this means that. This means he wants to be here and not there. But that group has to be given legal validity, legal recognition to be able to play that interpretive role. And then a third way we talk about people exercising their will and preferences is what we might call representative decision making. I appoint a power of attorney to make a healthcare decision for me if I'm not able to, or an advance directive. So those are the kind of three ways that we can think about providing support to exercise legal capacity. Okay, I need to conclude here. So a couple of examples, I put up here the example of an approach to providing supports is the personal ombuds system in Sweden. People with disabilities, and this is primarily, as I understand it, for people with psychosocial disabilities, can appoint a supporter. That person is accountable to them, they're paid for by the state, they have no decision-making authority, they assist the person on their own terms, and when the person wants to no longer have that person, it's fine. They have full legal capacity. In British Columbia, in Canada, we have supported decision-making in a couple of provinces. That provides for the appointment of supporters to a person on the basis that they have personal knowledge and a trusting relationship with the person, which is really critical because they have to do the work of interpretation. Okay. I think I'm going to, I've already made this point around translating expressions of will into legal decisions, how to deal with uncertainty. I mean, this is where it's going to be a challenge. This is likely going to, so supported decision-making helps address that challenge, and it provides authority to people who have the status to play that interpreter role. And in situations of uncertainty, to provide the best interpretation of that person's will and preferences. It's not always going to be easy, and there may be uncertainty, but what we need the law to do is recognize that principle that the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities articulates, that where there's uncertainty, there can be a best interpretation of that person's will and preferences if they have the support in place. So I think, I like this slide. Look at this slide. The two mountains move. So what does it mean to interpret another person's will and preference? It's Hans Gadamer, who is a philosopher of interpretation, talks about it. It's not like you can ever completely be in the position of the other person, but you can get close. He talks about it as a fusion of horizons. You know, when you're looking out at the horizon, I'm looking this way, Amita's looking that way, we see different things. Now, if she's going to support me, she's probably going to bring her chair closer to mine and try to see what direction I'm looking in. It's not going to be exactly what I'm seeing, but by looking this way, she starts to get a picture. And she, in knowing me, in knowing where I look and what I go to, she helps to understand my own horizon of meaning and use that to communicate in the world. What we need to do is give her interpretation of my horizon status in the world. I'm going to close here on a saying, or not a saying, one of my favorite quotes from Hans Gadamer. And he says, the essence of the question is the opening up, and this is the question of how to interpret, is the opening up and the keeping open of possibilities. And that's what our movement is about. We are looking at keeping open the possibilities for people who have been so denied and so excluded. To do that, we have to recognize that people don't do this on their own. Some people need others around them to stand beside them, try and look at the world from their perspective, and share who they are with the rest of the world as the basis for their legal capacity. Okay, thank you. Now I think, do we have, how much time do we, oh, they had asked me to, do we have a few minutes? Do we have a few minutes for questions? 10 minutes? Okay. Questions or comments, I think, for Professor...
Já temos uma pergunta ali. Ó. Só levantar a mão, o microfone chegará até vocês, ok?
English. I'm going to speak in English. Hi, Tina Minkowitz.
Your identification, please.
Tina Minkowitz from the USA Center for the Human Rights of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. And I am going to speak, so I hesitated to take the floor, but I'm speaking tomorrow. And I want to make the point that users and survivors of psychiatry, people with psychosocial disabilities, led the fight for full legal capacity, unequivocal legal capacity, the right to not have our legal capacity made conditional on whether, on anything, on this notion of mental capacity or on the question of having support or accommodation. And I welcome that APAE is taking this initiative, but I need to make the point that for the constituency, the community of people with psychosocial disabilities, which as a global movement simply rejects these notions that there is any kind of support that's needed for us as any conditionality on our exercise of legal capacity. It's a very different starting point from some of what we're hearing, and I think it's going to be important going forward in legal capacity reform and in practices of support, that we can understand support as something that is being provided to the person in addition to the fact that you simply have the right to exercise legal capacity. We have the right to the kind of supports we need, and we have the right to exercise legal capacity, full stop, simply because we're human beings. So I again, thank you for the opportunity. I apologize for taking the floor since I will speak tomorrow, but I think it's important to say this at the outset.
Boa tarde, meu nome é Esther Dorendache. Eu gostaria de saber como é trabalhado com a família esses aspectos jurídicos.
Could you repeat the question?
Como é trabalhado com as famílias todo o desenvolvimento dessas resistências nos aspectos jurídicos. Vocês trabalham com as famílias. Como é feito esse trabalho com elas? De autonomia, de independência, do apoio.
Os palestrantes pedem para que as perguntas sejam feitas e eles vão responder todas juntas, em bloco. Tá? Então, primeiro as perguntas e depois todos os comentários deles. Então, se alguém tiver mais perguntas, pode levantar a mão agora, ali no meio da plateia também tem mais uma pergunta. Obrigado. Mais uma outra pergunta aqui também. Vamos adiantando aqui primeiramente e em seguida a senhora ali, tá bom? Em seguida você, Grazi. Primeiro aqui, por favor.
Eu gostaria de saber, em termos de políticas públicas, tanto na Índia quanto no Canadá, se há alguma institucionalização, digamos, desse suporte apoiado para os agentes da lei, ou seja, juízes, atores do cenário legal, para que eles, primeiro, sejam conscientizados sobre a nova visão. E segundo, que eles aceitem um apoio a eles também, uma decisão apoiada para os próprios agentes da lei, operadores da lei.
Olá, o que me parece um desafio, um dos inúmeros desafios, é que para que haja suporte, há que ter pessoas, equipes, para fazer, digamos assim, essa tradução das vontades e preferências, né? O que exige uma política social, uma implementação de uma política social para que esses apoios existam. Parece que isso vem como pressuposto do exercício da liberdade, das vontades e da liberdade. O que parece subverter aquela ordem clássica dos direitos de primeira geração e de segunda geração, né? Dos direitos civis em primeiro lugar e dos direitos sociais em segundo lugar. Então, parece que viriam os sociais como um pressuposto do exercício da liberdade, né? E aí, me parece um enorme desafio num momento em que os estados são cada vez mais mínimos, em linhas gerais, né? Como implementar e como trazer o convencimento da importância dos suportes num contexto político de desmantelamento dos estados, de um estado cada vez menor.
Boa tarde, meu nome é Ingrid, eu sou professora, pedagoga, e a minha pergunta é um pouco no campo da educação. Aqui no Brasil, a gente tem, digamos que, diferentes modelos de atendimento às pessoas com deficiência. Nós temos instituições especializadas, temos as classes comuns, e no município tem alguns outros modelos, escola bilíngue, por exemplo, para as pessoas surdas. Eu gostaria de saber, no contexto do Canadá e da Índia, como que funciona a capacidade jurídica das pessoas em termos de modelos ou estruturas, sistemas de educação. Se vocês têm demanda das pessoas com deficiência que tem a intenção de frequentar um modelo de ensino, mas tem o impasse da família ou de outros querendo que elas frequentem outros espaços.
Okay, couple of questions here around, I'm going to just respond, I guess, to the questions first around as I understand it, how to protect the independence of individuals while recognizing families and understanding that there's a tension there between supporting the independence of individuals and families. And I want to link that to this question around how you make sure that there are supports in the community to actually, so you can put supports around a person, and then as another one person asked, and how would you do that in the context of this dismantling of the state in a kind of neoliberal era we're in where the state is contracting. I think this is an area certainly of tension, this one around independence of individuals and the role of family members as supporters. My own view of this is that, at least in the Canadian context and in other countries that I've been involved in terms of supported decision-making for people with intellectual disabilities, it's been driven by families. It's driven by families who were wanted to help advance the rights of people, and their leadership has helped drive that forward in the area of people with intellectual disabilities. So a big piece of this is family leadership. And I think our organizations, whether it's APAE or other organizations, making this work will, in part, it will require investment in the self-advocacy of people with disabilities themselves and in leadership of families to transform the ideas and perceptions that families have. And they've developed them for good reason, in many cases, because there hasn't been an inclusive society around that person and people aren't safe. We know the rates of violence that people experience are enormous. So families have real concerns. So I think really working directly with families and cultivating family leaders, along with self-advocate leaders, is going to be really critical in this. There are some models in Canada for making the supports available to people to help, whether it's advocacy support or helping a person develop a support network for supported decision-making, but it's very minimal, and this is one of our big challenges, whether it's in Brazil or Canada or anywhere else, is investment in these supports. In terms of, I mean, the committee has interpreted Article 12 to say this, providing supports is not about progressive realization, and Amita can talk more to that. The reality is haven't been successful yet in getting governments to put the dollars in for this support work. That said, I think we have to take it on ourselves in community. We can't wait for the state to put all the resources in place and design the system. APAE, local organizations have resources, they have experience, and I think we just have to start doing it, start creating it in communities. And in my own country, where we've got some provinces who are refusing to reform their laws, we're just moving ahead and getting people the support they need to have control over their lives, even if it hasn't yet been legally recognized. So a lot of this can happen at the community level, and as we experiment and innovate, we will develop models that hopefully we can convince the state to invest in. But we shouldn't wait for the state to do this. So developing community leadership, driving this from the community level, and it links to the point about education as well. People's right to be included, I think it starts in the education system, and it's why inclusive education is directly linked to this issue. If young students with intellectual disabilities, young learners, and are seen as people first, able to be included, they're going to have around them a community and a society that develops that expectation from the outset. There are parents who are resistant, there's no question, but again, that's a challenge for family leadership, developing parent and self-advocacy leaders that push for the agenda of inclusive education.
All right. I would sort of take a trifle different line from what Michael is saying. And though in my presentation I had said that legal reform is not all, I think it is important for us to appreciate that legal reform gives people, gives communities, gives individuals that kind of option to be able to drive their own way. See, this business of resistance between families and individual members is not unique to people with disabilities. It is something which happens whenever a member of a family wants to live a life which is distinct and different from what the family considers to be the way to go. I mean, we've had a huge amount of issues in relation to the question of caste. You have it in gender and you have it in disability. The critical thing for me somewhere is this, that the moment you start to speak about that individual person having a right of their own, which is distinct and different from the family, then willy-nilly, as with all other, I would not say it is as simple as that, in the sense of it's not just by the defiance of the individual that things fall in place, but the defiance of the individual member is a very integral part of breaking down family resistance. Because a lot of family resistance comes from the fact of the belief that the other, the person who's considered to be the person with disability, cannot do. And for you to be able to assert that you can, sometimes you need that assistance and support from the law. And that is wherein I make this distinction between recognition of legal capacity and support. Recognition of legal capacity, it's its own game, complete in itself. Support is incidental, wherein when you need it, I'm not saying that don't make provision for it, but when you recognize legal capacity, there's a certain body of support which is there in mainstream law for the rest of humans is also available to people with disabilities. Just one example, you have something like a power of attorney. You give it to another individual person to take care of those affairs you don't wish to take care of yourself. But a power of attorney can be only given by a person who has legal capacity. So the moment you recognize legal capacity, there are a range of legal artifacts which become available to an individual, and one needs to think from there. We don't have to wait to create support systems. There are ways in which non-disabled people have been using support over as much time as disqualification has been extended to people with disabilities. So that would be my response to quite many of the questions. How do you overcome family resistance? What is the support for, in the legal scenario? I mean, there was also this question on how India is handling it in relation to judges and administrators. We've had some very radical kind of judgments coming in from the judiciary where they have extended notions of autonomy and liberty to people with disabilities and insisted that whatever is the fair process that has to be extended to anyone else who is being deprived of life and liberty needs to be extended to people with disabilities. I do think that whilst creating of resources, talking in terms of support systems is welcome or maybe desired, but I would not put my primary money there. And why I would not put my primary money there? Because the moment you start to talk more on support than on legal capacity, you are in some manner falling into that same trap of people with disabilities not really being able to exercise legal capacity without support. And I think it's important that that particular distinction should be clearly observed, and the potential of legal capacity and the recognition of legal capacity, the doing away of disqualification is properly appreciated. It's an important distinction that needs to be put in place there. Because too much stress on support is, I'm all for stressing on support, provided that support is spoken of as a universal requirement of all humans. If we recognize that being human is being vulnerable, and that's not unique to people with disabilities, that's the kind of support that I think it is worth talking about. But otherwise, I would much rather, in the scheme of priorities, I want to put more money, or my money, at least on the equal recognition without discrimination of legal capacity, and letting then people, for their own genius, devising the kind of support they would need. Thank you, sir.
Muito obrigado, então, Amita, Danda e também ao Sr. Michael Bach pelas apresentações, por esta sessão de debates. Quaisquer dúvidas depois podem ser esclarecidas com os nossos apresentadores aqui. Senhoras e senhores, nós estamos com um horário um pouquinho adiantado. Nós faremos uma rápida pausa para o café, que é servido aqui mesmo, neste auditório, na parte de trás, e voltaremos em alguns instantes para a continuação com os temas. Muito obrigado a todos e até daqui a pouquinho.